Imagine building like the most precise robotic arms in human history.
Oh, absolutely.
Machines that can assemble electronics down to the microscopic level, engineered to just function flawlessly for millions of repetitive cycles. You achieve complete physical perfection on the factory floor, but then you take the company that builds those perfect robots and you subject them to the messy, chaotic reality of the global stock
Yeah,
market.
right. Where logic kind of goes out the window.
Exactly. Suddenly, that engineered logic just breaks down. You watch a company successfully dodge a massive supply chain crisis, increase their global sales, effectively pass on the cost of geopolitical tariffs to their buyers, and yet somehow their profit margins actually shrink because of basic internal overhead.
Yeah, it's a wild contradiction.
It really is. Welcome to this deep dive on the Japan Stock Podcast. Today we are looking at the ultimate industrial paradox, YASKAWA Electric. Our mission here is to extract the key drivers impacting earnings and growth for this mechatronics heavyweight, bypassing the fluff to see what actually moves their stock.
And honestly, if you track the Japan market, Yaskawa is a bellwether you simply cannot ignore.
Oh, for sure.
They don't just, participate in the industrial sector. Their technology essentially dictates the pace of modern global automation. We're talking about a company that operates perfectly at this intersection of a severe global labor shortage and the massive permanent shift toward data-driven manufacturing.
Yeah, and most investors have probably seen their hardware in action. Like if you've ever watched a video of a massive, incredibly fast Moto Man robot welding a car chassis in a blur of sparks, well, that's them.
Right, those videos are everywhere.
But the data we're looking at today shows that their true economic moat isn't just the metal arm itself. It's the microscopic brains and muscles inside the machinery.
Exactly.
Things like their Sigma X series of AC servos and their YRM controllers. I mean, the company actually has a legendary engineering pedigree. They invented the world's first vector control general purpose inverter and the world's first matrix converter.
Which is huge.
It is, but rather than just listing those as technical achievements, we really need to understand the mechanism behind them.
Yeah, let's put those inventions into functional terms because it really explains their market dominance. A vector control inverter essentially allows an electric motor to mathematically model and adjust its magnetic field and torque like instantly. Instantly.
Yeah.
It gives a mechanical arm almost human-like muscle control. So we can apply massive force 1 second and then microscopic delicacy the next.
It's incredible.
And a matrix converter bypasses the need for these bulky intermediate DC links to convert power. It makes the drive incredibly compact and highly energy efficient.
Right.
When a manufacturer is placing hundreds of these robots on a crowded factory floor, space and heat dissipation are, well, critical constraints. Yaskawa solved those physics problems decades ago.
It's just wild to think about, and knowing how they achieve that level of precision really helps explain their overall growth journey, because their corporate history is basically a masterclass in adapting to different macroeconomic eras.
Oh, completely.
I mean, they didn't start out building AI-driven robots. They started out building the heavy-duty motors that powered Japan's post-war high economic growth era. You know, the mass production of automobiles, refrigerators, and heavy appliances.
Right. But as that heavy industrial boom matured and inevitably slowed down, management demonstrated this ruthless willingness to pivot.
Yeah, they didn't just sit still.
Exactly. When the PC and electronics boom hit in the ensuing decades, Yaskawa miniaturized. They adapted that exact same high-torque motor technology into the cleanroom robots and precision servos required for semiconductor manufacturing. They basically provided the picks and shovels for the Silicon Age.
And now they are pivoting a third time straight into the IoT and AI data-driven society. You can actually see the physical manifestation of the strategy in the Yaskawa Technology Center, or YTC, which they opened in 2021.
Yeah, the YTC is fascinating.
It is. I was looking at the blueprints and operational flow of the facility, and what struck me is that it doesn't operate like a traditional assembly plant. It looks more like an integration hub where software architects and mechanical engineers are finally forced to work in the exact same room.
Which was the deliberate strategic intent of management.
Really?
Yeah, historically, a legacy industrial company might completely isolate its hardware divisions from its software developers.
Uh-huh.
The robotics team works over here, motor division works over there, and software is just an afterthought.
Just totally siloed.
Exactly. The YTC was built to smash those silos. By putting mechatronics integration entirely under one roof, they were engineering holistic automation solutions They develop the physical hardware and the data analytics simultaneously.
So they're selling the whole package.
Right, allowing them to sell entire optimized ecosystems rather than just standalone machines.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more because they are also fundamentally changing where they build those ecosystems. Management is aggressively pushing capital into a concept they call demand-side production.
Which is a huge shift.
It is. Instead of manufacturing their core robotics in Fukuoka and putting them on cargo ships, they are shifting heavy production capacity directly into the regions where the end users operate, specifically rapidly expanding inside China and Europe.
It acts as a structural defense mechanism for their balance sheet. Shortening the supply chain physically reduces global freight volatility. And manufacturing in the local currency provides natural insulation against the sudden foreign exchange swings that, well, constantly plague Japanese exporters.
That makes a lot of sense. But their strategic capital allocation isn't just geographical, right? It is also expanding into entirely new sectors. The data details their launch of new ventures into food and agri, meaning automated plant factories and food production lines.
Yeah.
And even more surprising, biomedical science, which involves automating genome analysis and regenerative medicine.
I know, it sounds a bit out there.
Right. Initially, I looked at that and thought it smelled like classic corporate diversification. Like, is a heavy industrial robotics company truly equipped to handle the incredibly delicate task of genome sequencing?
It's a fair question.
Mm-hmm.
But what's fascinating here is that the underlying physics of both tasks are actually identical.
Wait, identical how?
Well, whether an industrial arm is moving a heavy steel door onto an automotive frame, or a laboratory arm is moving a microscopic pipette filled with human DNA, the fundamental requirement is absolute precision motion control.
Oh, I see.
Human hands introduce contamination and fatigue into biomedical research. A machine does not. Yaskawa is simply taking their highly defensible technological moat, that vector control and servo precision we discussed, and deploying it into non-industrial, high-growth markets.
Wow.
It is a calculated move to smooth out the intense volatility of traditional industrial capital expenditure cycles.
Okay, it is fascinating that their micro-level technology is so adaptable. But while their mechatronics can handle genome sequencing flawlessly, they cannot engineer their way out of a geopolitical trade war.
No, nobody can.
Let's shift our focus to the global macro environment, specifically how trade policies in the United States and China are directly hitting their bottom line. And as we look at this, I want to be super clear to our listeners, we need to be strictly analytical. We are looking at these tariffs and industrial policies purely as business variables that affect Yaskawa's financials.
Exactly.
We are not taking any political stance on the policies themselves.
Total objectivity is required when analyzing global exposure. So let's look at the U.S. market first. Yaskawa is facing a severe and rapid tariff schedule, with U.S. import rates on their specific industrial goods jumping to 10% in April and then soaring to 24% by July 9th.
That is a brutal timeline for any supply chain manager to adapt to.
It really is.
Management actually quantified the expected negative impact on their earnings at 6.5 billion yen. And what is really intriguing is the internal breakdown of that number.
Yeah, that breakdown is revealing.
Right. About 5 billion yen of that hit comes from the obvious route, importing finished robots from Japan into the U.S. But the remaining 1.5 billion yen hit comes from importing parts for their local U.S. production lines.
Right.
It kind of proves that just putting a factory in Ohio doesn't fully shield you from trade policy if your subcomponents are still stuck in a globalized web.
Exactly. And to counter this exposure, management is accelerating their plans to completely localize parts sourcing within the U.S. for the long term. In the short term, however, they are neutralizing that entire 6.5 billion yen hit by implementing price surcharges.
So raising surcharges to fight tariffs is basically like passing the hot potato to the customer.
That's one way to put it, yeah.
They take the immediate kinetic energy of the tariff and pass it straight on to the buyer. But intuitively, that feels dangerous. If a robot suddenly costs 24% more, wouldn't a factory owner simply cancel the order?
You would think so. In a normal environment, yes. But the data reveals a really counterintuitive reality here. The demand for robotics right now is remarkably inelastic.
Really? Why is that?
First, Yaskawa's competitors face the exact same tariff pressures, meaning the entire industry is raising prices simultaneously, keeping the competitive playing field level.
So there's nowhere cheaper to go anyway.
Right.
And because their demand is so inelastic right now, buyers are willing to swallow the 24% surcharge just to keep their lines running.
Exactly, because the alternative is catastrophic. The labor shortage across the U.S. and Europe has fundamentally altered the math of capital allocation. Factory owners are dealing with skyrocketing human wage demands and a physical lack of available workers.
So they have to automate.
They have no choice. Even with an inflated price tag, buying a YASKAWA robot is still significantly cheaper than failing to staff a production line and missing delivery quotas. The economic cost of not automating is now significantly higher than the cost of the tariff.
That is a wild shift in the economic reality. Turning to their operations in China, the macroeconomic narrative there has completely shifted over the last few years as well.
Oh, completely.
The old Made in China 2025 initiative, which was heavily focused on turning the country into an advanced export powerhouse, has morphed into a focus on new infrastructure. We're looking at massive state-directed investment into domestic demand, things like 5G networks, solar power expansion, and a total pivot toward electric vehicle supply chains.
And YASKAWA's regional strategy aligns perfectly with that domestic push.
Yeah.
Every single one of those new infrastructure sectors requires high-density, highly automated manufacturing that human hands literally cannot perform at scale.
Right.
You just cannot stack microscopic EV battery cells by hand. Furthermore, management is projecting strong operational resilience despite the broader, widely reported fears regarding China's real estate sector and their localized power grid constraints.
Yeah, the financials noted that management essentially treats the property sector issues as isolated from their core industrial client base, and they view the power constraints as manageable logistics rather than existential threats.
Yeah, from a factory manager's perspective on the ground in China, power constraints are executed through planned peak cuts.
Oh, planned, not random blackouts.
Exactly. Because these are methodical, scheduled reductions, YASKAWA and its local clients can easily adapt. They shift their operating hours to off-peak times or utilize localized in-house generators. The assembly lines do not stop, which keeps YASKAWA's regional revenue streams highly resilient.
This resilience in their local operations brings us perfectly to how YASKAWA controls its own destiny internally. I want to build a causal chain here between their digital transformation, their supply chain management, and a really surprising squeeze on their profit margins.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. The true test of their internal operational machinery occurred during the peak global component shortages, which were severely exacerbated by events like the massive COVID lockdowns in Vietnam. Many of their industrial peers experienced complete paralysis in their sourcing networks because they lacked visibility into their Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers.
But YASKAWA leveraged an initiative they call YDX, or YASKAWA Digital Transformation. Instead of just using YDX as a corporate buzzword, they used the constant stream of global operational data to identify supply chain bottlenecks before they actually manifested physically.
Which is incredible. Predictive analytics allowed them to create a digital map of their entire component network. When a region like Vietnam locked down, YDX data flagged the specific microchips that would be delayed before the primary suppliers even picked up the phone.
Wow.
This allowed management to aggressively secure massive amounts of component inventory months ahead of the competition. They were preempting the shortages rather than reacting to them.
Dodging a huge bullet. And that foresight directly translated into top-line financial growth. Because they had the necessary components sitting in their warehouses, they could fulfill massive global demand while competitors had their lines halted. They secured huge orders for electric vehicle painting robots in Korea, capturing the general automation boom we discussed earlier. This proactive sourcing drove their overall sales up by 4.8%. Reaching an impressive 234.7 billion yen.
Yet, this is exactly where the structural vulnerability in their business model appears.
Yeah.
Despite that 4.8% revenue growth, and despite successfully implementing surcharges to cover their tariff costs, their operating profit actually dropped 3.7%, falling to 25.1 billion yen.
That's tough.
Consequently, their operating profit margin deteriorated by a full percentage point, dropping to 10.7%.
It is the ultimate paradox. Here's where it gets really interesting. They sell more robots, they successfully dodge a historic supply chain crisis, pass their material costs onto the consumer, and they still make less profit. The earnings data pins this margin squeeze specifically on a sharp increase in indirect costs.
Which tells us this margin deterioration has absolutely nothing to do with the cost of raw steel, motors, or semiconductor components. If we connect this to the bigger picture, It shows that top-line growth and smart supply chain management aren't enough if indirect operational costs aren't strictly controlled. Indirect costs are the structural friction of the company: overhead, administration, internal logistics, and support staff.
Oh, I see.
When a company rapidly transitions from a traditional hardware exporter into a global solutions provider, opening massive integration facilities like the YTC and aggressively localizing production lines across China and Europe, the administrative and compliance layers required to manage that complexity often balloon much faster than the incoming revenue.
Okay, so they successfully built a massive, highly efficient industrial engine to generate top-line growth, but the internal administrative friction is basically eating up all the torque before it ever reaches the wheels.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And as any analyst will tell you, top-line growth means absolutely nothing if your internal cost structure is constantly leaking profit. Management clearly recognizes this threat, which is why their strategy for fixing the margin squeeze isn't just about selling more mechatronics.
Mm.
It is about fundamentally restructuring their human capital and corporate organization.
That leads directly to a major structural move they made in 2023, which really stood out in the sources. They completely integrated their human resources and labor departments with their public relations and investor relations departments.
Merging human resources with investor relations. That's a highly unconventional organizational move for a legacy industrial manufacturer.
It really is. Usually, human resources handles the employee metrics internally, and investor relations focuses entirely outward, talking to the institutional analysts on Wall Street.
Yeah, those two departments rarely interact.
Exactly. But Yaskawa's management is operating under a newly defined philosophy. They stated, every single employee is the Yaskawa brand itself.
They codified this under the initiative name One Yaskawa. In today's capital markets, with the rising emphasis on ESG, environmental, social, and governance mandates, employer branding is directly tied to institutional investor confidence.
Okay.
Institutional funds want proof of sustainable labor practices. If a company can demonstrate a highly engaged, aligned workforce, investors trust that management actually has the internal discipline to execute on their long-term visions, like reining in those spiraling indirect costs.
So by putting human resources and investor relations in the exact same room, they ensure the internal culture directly feeds the external investment narrative.
Precisely.
An engaged, well-trained employee base is naturally more productive, more innovative, and requires significantly less administrative friction to manage, which directly attacks that overhead problem dragging down their margins.
There is also a critical defensive element to this merger. Because Yaskawa is competing heavily in the AI and data analytics space to build out their integrated automation solutions, they are now fighting for top-tier engineering talent against massive, highly lucrative software companies.
Oh, of course.
By elevating their employer brand to the level of global investor relations, they make themselves far more attractive to the specific high-level talent they desperately need to build the next generation of industrial technology. You simply cannot build the factory of the future if you cannot hire the engineers of the future.
It requires recognizing that human capital is literally just another form of capital that needs to be rigorously optimized, measured, and marketed. It all comes back to the core theme of efficiency. So, as we bring all these threads together to project forward into the company's Vision 2025, the causal chain for the next few years becomes incredibly clear.
Yeah, management must successfully execute on three distinct operational fronts. First, they have to neutralize U.S. and global trade volatility by making their local demand-side production facilities fully self-sufficient regarding parts sourcing.
Right.
Second, they absolutely must rein in the administrative bloat and internal friction to stop the margin bleed we identified. And third, they need to continue deploying their integrated hardware and data solutions to capture the inelastic demand created by structural global labor shortages.
And if they can hit those specific targets, they achieve what management calls their Realize 100 legacy, which is locking in a permanently high-profit corporate structure while contributing to a highly automated, sustainable society. So what does this all mean for you as you watch the Japan market? You are looking at a company that is applying the exact same ruthless optimization of its own robotic engineering directly onto its corporate balance sheet.
It really prompts a broader structural question for anyone allocating capital in the industrial sector right now. We constantly worry about sudden supply chain shocks, shifting trade policies, and geopolitical tariffs. But considering Yaskawa's massive global deployment and inelastic demand, it raises an important question.
What's that?
Are we entering an era where localized factory automation is no longer just a basic efficiency tool? but actually the ultimate corporate hedge against geopolitical risk.
Wow, that is a phenomenal thought to leave on. Because at the end of the day, when the logic of the global macro environment gets murky and chaotic, the companies that survive and reward shareholders are the ones that can engineer their own predictability. Thank you for joining us for this earnings deep dive on the Japan Stock Podcast. We'll see you next time.